This is lesson 952 in Imperialism in Africa and India. And we've got a history quote. It's an African proverb, and it says, "Until the lion learns to write, every story will glorify the hunter." And that's the way it has been with imperialism until somewhat recently. All of our stories romanticized the imperialists and the conquerors and the oppressors and talked about how loving and caring they were, or how intrepid and brave they were. And the people who were oppressed in places like Africa and Asia didn't have as loud a voice. So all the stories glorified the imperialists. So what is imperialism? Imperialism is the policy of either taking over another country or establishing economic and political control over other nations. The U.S. and Western Europe became very imperialistic from the mid-19th to the mid-20th centuries. There were two primary goals, and they were closely related. First one was gaining new natural resources to feed their factories, and the second one was gaining new trade markets for the things that their factories produced. So both of these goals were directly related to the Industrial Revolution, weren't they? So causes of Western imperialism. There were economic causes, just as we said, the need for raw materials, the need for markets. There were also political causes. There were social justification causes, such as social Darwinism and cultural superiority. There were also technological causes, such as military technology, communication, transportation, and even medicines, medical technology. Let's start with the economic causes of new imperialism. Industrialized countries needed, as we said twice already, raw materials for their factories, commodities such as rubber, iron, coal, oil, copper, aluminum, cotton, etc., for industrial production. Likewise, these industrialized countries also needed more markets to sell what came out of their factories. They needed to keep those factories running so that those factories continued to employ people. Colonies were those markets. Political causes of new imperialism. The newer, emerging Western powers, Germany, Italy, Belgium, the United States, and Japan, wanted colonies for prestige and to prove that they were as strong as those older colonial powers that we've studied, Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands. And all of them, new and old, feared that their European neighbors would disrupt the balance of power in Europe by gaining more colonies in Africa and Asia. Social justifications as causes for new imperialism. The White Man's Burden. That was a poem by Rudyard Kipling, the guy who wrote The Jungle Book, and it's a good example of the European attitude of cultural and racial superiority towards the non-industrialized world. The white man's burden is supposedly to educate and improve everyone else, whether they're grateful for this or not. Rudyard Kipling actually wrote this poem in the Philippines in the year 1899, and he sent it to President Theodore Roosevelt in order to encourage the United States to expand into these islands. The poem described the indigenous peoples of the colonial world as half devil, half child. And this idea justified the sending of missionaries to Christianize native peoples. That's for the devil half. And it also justified an attitude of paternalism, acting like a father to his children with the moral authority to discipline his colonies if they are disobedient. And that's the child half. Darwinism. Scientist Charles Darwin proposed a very popular theory to explain how new species of plants and animals arise, and he called it natural selection. Natural selection said that certain species were selected by nature to either thrive or decline based on the interplay between the traits that they inherited and the environment that they lived in. From Darwinism, thanks to Herbert Spencer, you get social Darwinism. Two different things. They both have the name Darwinism in them, but they're two very different things. English scholar Herbert Spencer took Darwin's scientific idea of natural selection and he renamed it survival of the fittest. And that was a term that he thought would be easier for people to understand. And then he took his survival of the fittest idea and he started applying it to his study of different human groups. And Spencer's resulting theory became known as social Darwinism. Spencer claimed that some groups of people were just naturally more fit to thrive economically, that is, white Europeans, and others were naturally unfit to thrive, that's the non-white, non-Europeans. In other words, Herbert Spencer was a racist. Spencer's social Darwinism provided a scientific justification for racism and the exploitation of others. Technological causes of new imperialism. Several types of new technologies allowed Europeans to penetrate and dominate places that they had never been able to access before. These technologies were developed and mass-produced as a direct result of the Industrial Revolution. In other words, Europeans subjugated all these places because now they could. There was military technology. Rifles, machine guns, bombs, gunboats, etc. All of these gave imperial powers a major advantage over indigenous peoples. For example, the notorious Maxim machine gun, and you can see a picture of it right here. There was communication technology. Railroads and the telegraph made communication around the colonies much easier. And this facilitated swift and overwhelming military responses wherever indigenous peoples might rise up against their oppressors. There were medical technologies. Advances in medicine made it less risky to take over tropical areas, and this was especially true of the drug quinine, which drastically reduced the effects of the tropical disease malaria for Europeans. Methods of imperialism. Method 1. Direct control. With method 1, you simply go in and you take control of another country. Example, Britain's rule over India. You go into the country, you remove the ruler, you station a powerful military force there, and you establish a large professional bureaucracy to administer the colony. What is a bureaucracy? We've answered this before, but just to rehash it, it's an organization characterized by specialization of functions, adherence to fixed rules, and a hierarchy, multiple levels of authority. The word bureau means a specialized unit, as in the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. Method 2, indirect rule. With indirect rule, what you do is you rule behind the scenes through local rulers. The local rulers, they still have some power, but they have to cooperate with imperial powers. And the imperial countries force exploitative trade agreements upon these victims. An example, European control over China. While we're still on method 2, let's talk about the exploitation of colonized people. Exploitation means to use meanly or unfairly for one's own advantage. And imperialists educated and trained small amounts of natives as clerks, technicians, soldiers, and even police to help them run their colonies. Sometimes this method backfired as native troops mutinied against their imperial masters. Labor reorientation. Imperialists ran the country, and they made policy decisions purely for the benefit of the mother country and not at all for the benefit of the colonized people. Natives were often treated like slaves and worked in mines and fields, and their labor was spent on benefiting the imperial power rather than upon their own country. The impact of imperialism upon colonies. Number 1, new infrastructure. Imperial powers built wonderful new railroads and ports and power grids and telegraphs, etc. But all of this infrastructure was built entirely for the purpose of extracting resources and maintaining control, not at all for the benefit of the people actually living there. The Suez Canal connected the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. The Panama Canal connected the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. And these are wonderful things that still benefit us today. But keep in mind, they were built purely for the benefit of imperial powers. A second impact was the diffusion of European languages into the colonies. Diverse peoples were taught European languages in order to communicate. For example, English, French, and Spanish. And this became important to later independence movements and leaders. Third effect, militarism and rivalry. Western imperialism led to intense rivalries between European powers. And this meant that each European power had to build up its military to offset the others. And this would have very serious and tragic consequences later. A fourth impact of imperialism, vast imperial wealth. Imperial powers became richer in land and resources at the expense of the colonies, who became poorer. This is a very interesting cartoon. You've got somebody saying, colonial powers be like, look how advanced and wealthy we are. Why can't you be more like us, Africa? Why are you so uncivilized? Why are you poor? Why are you starving? Well, you can see why they're poor and starving, because everything they have has been scooped out and sent to North America and Europe. A fifth impact of imperialism, the legacy of Western imperialism in Africa continues to this day. For example, the country of Ghana exports cocoa beans to Switzerland, but imports chocolate. The country of Angola exports oil, but imports 80% of its gasoline. Why? Why can't Ghana build its own chocolate factories and then start exporting chocolate? Or why can't Angola build its own oil refineries and export gasoline? It's because powerful Western forces like it the way it is, and they want it to stay that way. Sixth impact. U.S. and Germany emerged as world powers. The U.S. won the Spanish-American War and gained colonies throughout the world. And Germany participated in the scramble for Africa. The Berlin Conference, 1884, for Africa. Germany presided over what was called the Berlin Conference among all the Western powers in the year 1884. And this conference settled the scramble for Africa. European powers divided up Africa among themselves. No Africans were represented in the entire conference. Goals of the 1884 Berlin Conference. Europeans wanted to exploit gold, diamonds, and other minerals. They totally ignored the ethnic and religious makeup of the various African peoples when dividing up Africa. Therefore, many borders and divisions made no sense locally, and this led to violent civil wars throughout Africa in the 20th century. A good example, Rwanda in the 1990s. The Belgians had artificially created two ethnic groups, the Tutsis and the Hutus, for their own purposes during colonial times. And in 1994, one group carried out an all-out genocide of the other, involving machetes and other weapons. Between 800,000 and 1 million people were murdered in just 100 days. Americans were practically unaware of it because we were all watching the O.J. Simpson events on TV. Imperialism in India, the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857. In 1857, the British East India Company was running much of India. They employed Indian soldiers called sepoys, and some sepoys mutinied in 1857. As a result, the British government dissolved the British East India Company, and then the British government took direct control of India. And Queen Victoria of England became Empress of India, among her many titles. The impact of British rule over India. There was an economic impact. India got lots of roads and bridges and railroads and telegraphs. But Indian cottage industries suffered. They couldn't compete with British manufactured goods. And we've talked about that at length when we talked about the Industrial Revolution. There was a government impact. India was unified through single government, single legal system, and language. Health impact. Medicines and famine relief led to a population explosion in India. And of course, it came with a social impact because the British treated Indians as inferior.